Good afternoon. My name is Nancy Hill, and I am chair of the Board of Directors for ChildFund International, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first Innovation Fair. I'm calling it the first Innovation Fair because I think we should do this, and Ann's going to throw something at me. I'm so glad she's in the back of the room. I don't know how good her throw is. But I just thought this was an amazing day. It was truly an amazing day. I mean, it's not innovation for innovation's sake. I think we're in a moment in history. We're in a moment in history where technology, it's enabling us to be more aware of the needs of children across the globe. It's enabling us to collaborate in real time when it used to take forever to get a letter from one place to another. And we're more aware than ever than before that we can't solve the world's problems by ourselves, in our own silos, in our own countries, in our own communities. We do the work at the level of the community and the neighborhood, but we must do our innovation at the level of ChildFund across the globe. So we saw a lot of innovations today, so here are some of my favorites. The global strategic partnerships. I love the rugby example where the girls are playing rugby. I love that. I'm a data geek for those of you who don't know me or those of you do I love the use of data and data visualization so that we can in real time see where the needs are and our impact. I love the innovation about bringing children's voices out of the neighborhoods, out of the communities, and onto the global stage. And our ability to do that innovatively and across our sites is just amazing. So I also learned that innovation it's tough. It requires negotiation. It requires data. It requires partner or power sharing. We have to share the power with those we want to collaborate with. It takes time. It takes time when the need is urgent, but we have to take the time. And so at a time when, many startups come and go, we are bringing 80 years of experience to this game. 80 years. So the challenge for an organization like ours is how do we bring the wisdom and the experience of 80 years, while at the same time put that in conversation with the agility and the nimbleness that we need to move in real time to address the pressing needs of children. We're more aware of them, and so it's more urgent. So how do we bring wisdom and experience and agility, the agility of a startup? And so it's been a fantastic day, and I hope you've come away with great ideas and new collaborations and new networking. And it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker who's going to cap off the day for us. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ann Mei Chang. Ann Mei is a leading advocate of social innovation, and she's also the author of Lean Impact. Have you seen this? Lean Impact, How to Innovate for Radically Greater Social Good. I want to know more about that. She, as the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID, Ann Mei served as the first Executive Director of U.S. Global Development Lab. She started her career in the technology industry. She's a seasoned technology executive with more than 20 years experience at places like Google, Apple, and Intuit, and a range of startups. She started her own startup and learned a lot from that. And so she's really trying to bring what we know from tech startups to the social sector. And so she's written this book, and she's going to talk to us about Lean Impact. If you haven't gotten your copy, it's hot off the press. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, and you can't have mine. So join me in welcoming Ann Mei Chang.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Hi, everybody. I know it's been a long, exciting day. I hope we can keep you awake. So I'm wondering, do any of you also feel like, despite all our enormous efforts, that we just don't seem to be making enough of a dent on the problems that plague our society, including for vulnerable children? I certainly do. And if anything, the world as we know it is continuing to change faster and faster every year. Problems are getting more and more complex. And so if we're going to be able to make a difference, let alone get ahead, we're going to need to figure out a way to speed up our own pace of progress in global development. And that's what Lean Impact is about. So just to put it in context, I think you're probably all familiar with the SDGs. The world came together and set us 17 goals that map out a vision for the world that we want. And now, 3 years later, we realize that we're not on target to hit many of these goals. People often talk about the gap as a $2 to $3 trillion a year gap. But I would argue, it's very unlikely we're going to find $2 to $3 trillion a year somewhere. And so I think the more important question to ask is, for the dollars we do have, how are we going to get more bang for the buck? And that's, of course, where innovation comes in. And I think because people recognize this these days, everywhere I go, people are talking about innovation. I think it's the most overused buzzword in the English language today. And it's important, but I think it's also misunderstood. I would say too many of the efforts I see are focused on kind of the flashy new ideas. Make a great press release, make a great splash, but then kind of fizzle off. But what innovation, my experience of innovation, sort of having lived and breathed it in Silicon Valley, is that, innovation is not always so sexy. It's about testing and failing and iterating and doing it over and over again to figure out how to take that germ of a good idea and actually have it have meaningful impact in the world. In other words, innovation is the path, but impact is the destination. And so, how many of you heard of a book called Lean Startup? Is this something people are familiar with? A few people? So Lean Startup is a New York Times bestseller, sold over 1 million copies. It's a book that was written by Eric Ries about 7 years ago that did a phenomenal job just capturing the nuts and bolts of how innovation actually happens in Silicon Valley, beyond the headlines. And what he talks about is that the Lean Startup is a process for how we build new products and services under conditions of extreme uncertainty. This came out of the tech world in Silicon Valley. And of course, a tech startup works under conditions of extreme uncertainty because they're trying to build products that no one has ever built before. And I would argue that in the global development sphere, for most of the things we do, we're also working under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Uncertainty both in that we're working in contexts that are dynamic and rapidly changing and highly complex, but we're also working with solutions that are generally insufficient to the problems that we have at hand, that we haven't cracked the nut yet to find the solution that's going to actually fix the problems that we're trying to solve, at least not at sufficient scale. And so, given that we're working in conditions of extreme uncertainty, we need to take a different approach. If if you have a solution, it's going to work, it's going to work well enough and for enough people, then what you really need is to focus on predictable execution, right? And so you figure out all the tools you need to make sure that you're going to execute predictably, and you do that. There's very few problems that I think those of us in this room try to tackle that look like that. Instead, we're trying to tackle problems that we don't have a full grasp on yet, that we're making a dent, but not enough of a dent. And in those cases, we need to focus on something different, which is accelerating our pace of learning. And so, if we want to accelerate our pace of learning, we need to do something different. We don't need to have a grandmaster plan and execute on that plan. What we need to do is figure out how to experiment, learn as quickly as possible, and improve on what we're doing. And so that's what the Lean Startup is based on. And certainly Lean Startup, as it came out of Silicon Valley, has a bunch of tools that are more, that were designed and intended for and shaped by the tech industry. But I think the same principles really apply to the world of social good, the world of global development as well. But the reality is it's much harder. People think, if we're just going to do good, that's the easy stuff. The reality that I've seen is it's a lot harder. And so, what I've been doing is trying to look at how do we translate these tools that have really been proven to work to generate phenomenal innovation in Silicon Valley and bring them to the world of, making the world a better place. And so in the course of writing my book, I interviewed over 200 organizations, big and small, domestic and international, nonprofits and for-profits, and everything in between, and really sought out the most successful organizations that were making the biggest impact and tried to learn from them to see what was the difference. And what I distilled down were 3 principles I'd love to share with you. Let me start with think big. You know, one of the things that I noticed in coming into the global development sphere is that we tend to plan based on constraints. You know, we look at, okay, we have this many dollars, we have this many people, we have a grant we're applying for that's this size and scope. What can we do with these resources? That's how we tend to approach problems. Instead, I'd argue that we should approach problems by starting with the size of the need. What is the need in the world? What would it take to move the needle on a problem so that we achieve the SDGs, so that we actually solve a problem once and for all? And so that's where I think we need to start, is to think much bigger, be much more audacious about the change that we're trying to create. And again, to put that in perspective, some of the things that we've traditionally done over the last 30 years in global development, over the last 30 years, like access to clean water, electricity, and sanitation, we've made slow but steady progress over the last 30 years. And we say that this is hard because, you know, we're trying to work with people who are very poor. We're trying to work with people who live in remote rural areas. So it's difficult. So, you know, we can't do much better than this. And yet, during the same period of time, in these same communities, adoption of mobile phones has skyrocketed. Right? So what's the difference here? Certainly not everything's going to look like mobile phones, but there's a number of differences. One is that there was a technology breakthrough, that we have technology that didn't exist before, that dramatically created new capabilities that we didn't have. We also had something that is something that people are really compelled by. People really want mobile phones. You know, I've heard numerous stories about how people will top up their mobile phone before they'll buy food in many cases, because it serves a compelling need for them to stay connected with loved ones, to access economic opportunities, and so forth. And so people really demand it. And third is that there's a business model. Companies can sell devices, they can sell minutes, and so then they can invest in R&D to create better, lower cost devices, to expand their distribution channels, both for selling minutes and for selling phones. And so a combination of all these things and more, mobile phones have really taken off. Now, of course, in the world of global development, a lot of the things that we do, it's not a private sector business model, and it's you know, the paths to scale look very different. But I think we should strive to look at how can we get, you know, a growth curve that looks more like this. And so let me give you an example of what that might look like in more of the world we work in by sharing the story of Vision Spring. Vision Spring is a social enterprise. They decided to focus on a 700-year-old innovation that has been proven to improve productivity and learning potential, but that is not, but that there's 2.5 billion people who need it and don't have it, and that's eyeglasses. Now, this is not a whiz-bang new invention, right? This is something that's been around for a long time, but for many reasons, so many of the people who can benefit don't have it yet. And so what did Vision Spring do? They started out like most nonprofits would. They decided to focus on 2 geographies. They set up shop, brought in a bunch of people they called vision entrepreneurs to go into rural areas, do eye exams, and sell glasses. And they came back with great stories, right? People who thought they couldn't see, were blind and were able to see again. People who weren't able to work, being able to work again. Kids being able to study and be able to advance in school. Many nonprofits would be happy with this, but they weren't. It wasn't enough. You know, they knew that they were losing money for every person they reached. They would never raise enough money to get to their 2.5 billion goal, and so they pivoted. Their next incarnation is that they set up vision centers in more urban areas and created a hub and spoke area, model where their vision centers would make money from more affluent customers in the city, and they would take those profits and they would plow them into serving, you know, the more remote communities. And in this way, they became financially self-sustainable. Also in the nonprofit world, like a huge success for most of us. But they recognized it still wasn't enough, because in order for, even though they were financially self-sustainable, in order for them to get out to the, everyone in the world who could benefit, it would take them decades, if not centuries, to build out the infrastructure to do so. So they pivoted again. This time, they decided to partner. They partnered with an organization called BRAC in Bangladesh, who already had a network of community healthcare workers across the country. And so they decided to distribute their eyeglasses through this existing network. And together with BRAC now, they've been able to serve over 1 million people with eyeglasses. And they've also since formed many, many other partnerships and have now just been able to reach 4.5 million people. Again, something most nonprofits would be happy about. 4.5 million people, that's pretty good, right? But they still weren't satisfied. 4.5 million is still a tiny fraction of 2.5 billion. And what they realized was that doing this on a retail level, they would just never get there. That there were systemic issues. There were market failures where eyeglass manufacturers weren't incentivized to produce low-cost enough eyeglasses or distribute them to more rural areas, where governments weren't satisfying the vision care needs of their citizens. And so they decided to pivot one more time. They started something called the Eyelliance, which is a public-private partnership that brings together eyeglass manufacturers and nonprofits and local governments and looks at how do we heal those market and system failures so that everyone who needs eyeglasses can get them. And so one of the early successes was a MOU they signed with the government of Liberia, where the government of Liberia agreed to incorporate eye care, vision care, into their government healthcare system as well as their public school system. And so you can imagine that through these kind of more systemic approaches, they will hopefully eventually get to the 2.5 billion. And so I think what's exciting about Vision Spring is, their journey shows many steps along the way of what does it look like to really scale in this world. Not just, they're a relatively small organization still. They haven't scaled their organization, but they're dramatically scaling their impact, and that's what matters. So the second principle I want to talk about is starting small. Once you have that audacious goal, the temptation is to start executing as fast as we can and deliver as much as we can. But I'd argue that if we start small, we can make a bigger impact over time. Because when you start small, when you start working with 5 or 10 or 50 people, you can experiment much more quickly, much more cheaply, and accelerate that pace of learning. And the faster that you can learn, as we talked about earlier, the faster you're likely to get to a better solution. So just to compare, the way that I've seen us typically run programs in the nonprofit world is that we like to plan a lot. We like to sit in meetings. We like to write proposals. We like to write designs. We like to write work plans, right? Does that sound familiar to any of you? We like to plan a lot. And so, by the time something gets out and starts being delivered, we've often been planning it, like maybe it starts at USAID, planning something, they put out a RFP, and then, nonprofits bid for it, and then they actually create the one they win, they create a work plan. By the time you actually get out into the field and start doing something, it could be a couple years since you first conceived of this notion. And then you run it for 3 to 5 years, right? And there's so many things that could go wrong. Right? We're making a lot of assumptions. We're living in complex environments. A lot of the conditions could have changed in the meantime. And so when we wait so long to deliver, we build up a lot of risk over time. A lot of things could go wrong. So instead, the lean approach says, how do we break that down? How do we take smaller steps and get out more quickly, learn from what happens in the real world, adapt what we're doing, and then try again, double down if it's working. And that's really the heart of what Lean is about, is really looking at how do we go from planning for years and then hoping for the best to trying to take much smaller steps and testing each step of the way and adapting each step of the way so that we get to a solution that's much better. And so at the core of the Lean Startup and Lean Impact is something we call the build, measure, learn feedback loop. Now, this isn't rocket science. This is really, the essence behind Lean Startup is really the scientific method. So just as with the scientific method, you come up with you have a solution, you have a hypothesis about what your solution's going to do, what's the benefit it's going to provide, what's going to happen when you deploy your solution. And so what we suggest is that you build an experiment, something Eric calls an MVP or minimum viable product, to test your assumption, to see is what I think is going to happen actually going to happen? Then we measure, we gather data, we see what happened, we get the data, we look at the data, and finally we learn. We learn, did it work? Did what we expect happen? If so, maybe we can double down on this. If it didn't happen, like maybe there's something we need to tweak. Maybe we learned something along the way, we saw something didn't quite proceed as we had planned, so we can tweak something. Or we might recognize that we're fundamentally off course and need to take a different path altogether. And so what's crucial in this is, we all do this. Everyone does build, measure, learn. The question is how quickly, right? So in many of the global development programs I've seen, this cycle can take years, right? You do all your planning, you deploy something, eventually you run a midline evaluation, an endline evaluation, and you learn, and then you roll that into your next proposal, right? And so that cycle can take years. So the key is, how do we drive the build, measure, learn feedback loop to go from years to days or weeks? Because we can learn on that pace of days or weeks, we're going to much more quickly be able to try a lot of different ideas and be able to figure out which ones are going to work. And when it comes to the world of social innovation, where we're innovating for social good, there are three dimensions that I think are crucial for us to ensure that we deliver on for any solution. And that's value, impact, and growth. So value is this something people actually want, like mobile phones? Impact is, if they want it, does it work? Does it actually deliver the impact that we're seeking? Does it have that benefit? And growth is, if it does deliver that impact, can we get it to all the people who could benefit? And so too often I see either design methodologies or organizations be very good at one or two of these, but rarely all three. And then we usually fall down and we don't move the needle as much because we're not covering all three of these. You could have a solution that works really, really well, but only gets to a small number of people. Or you could get something to a huge number of people, but it really doesn't make that much difference. And so the key is trying to figure out how we actually deliver on all three of these by testing for and optimizing for the value, impact, and growth of any solution. So I'm going to talk about each of these three pillars of social innovation, starting with value. So the bar for value, in my experience, is not just, is this something people want? They're happy if you give it to them. It's, is this something people really deeply value? It solves a significant pain point for them. It's something that they'll demand, come back for, tell all their friends about, beat down your doors for. Because if people want what you're offering, it's going to be so much easier for you to deliver impact and growth. So what does that look like? Of course, you all know, I don't need to tell you, that when it comes to coming up with a solution in this world, we need to get proximate to the problem. We need to understand the people that we're serving, what their true needs are, because their cultures may be very different than ours, their situations may be very different than ours. And so that means getting proximate to our customers. There's actually an organization in Myanmar called Proximity Designs that has really embodied this spirit, where when they decided to work with smallholder farmers in Myanmar, the founders moved to Myanmar, set up shop there so that they could bring in farmers every day to work with them from the very beginning on understanding their problems, designing solutions, and then going out and testing those solutions in the field so that they have that tighter feedback loop and can get, can daily get the feedback from people on like whether what they're thinking is actually, meeting their needs. One of the things that we tend to do, though, to get feedback is we tend to just ask people, do you want this? Do you like this? We do surveys, we do focus groups, and so forth. The reality is, asking people what they want hypothetically is often incredibly inaccurate. And asking people what they do hypothetically is also very inaccurate. There's a social enterprise called Nextleaf that creates sensors, wireless sensors. And one of the ways they use wireless sensors is in clean cook stoves. And so they were working with a community in India where clean cook stoves had been distributed, but were only being used by about 10% of the families. And they were wondering why. And so they installed sensors to understand how the cook stoves were being used. One thing that they found was that the data they were getting back from their sensors had zero correlation with what people were telling them. Sometimes people would tell them they were using it a lot and they weren't using it at all. Some people they would say we're not using it at all and they were actually using it. There's just like no correlation. But by getting the sensor data, they had an anchor that they understood this is actually what's happening. And it wasn't sufficient in and of itself to figure out what they needed to do, but it started the conversation so they could know what to ask about. And through that, they had a number of conversations, understood what some of the impediments were in terms of the design. The cook stoves they were using couldn't hold enough wood to heat the stove for long enough to cook a full meal, or they were awkward to load, and so forth. And by improving on these designs, they were able to increase the usage of these clean cook stoves from about 10% to almost 100%. So what does like a minimum viable product look like? Let me share the story of Copia Global, which is a social enterprise in Kenya. They set out to figure out how do we get a much greater variety of consumer goods out to people who are living in rural areas that really usually only have access to a small number of staples. And so what a typical organization might do is to say, okay, we're going to set up some warehouses, we're going to set up distribution infrastructure, we're going to get a bunch of agents, and we're going to create a beautiful catalog, and then we're going to run this business. Instead, Copia decided to run an MVP. What they did was CEO, Crispin, went to the supermarket in Nairobi, the Nakumatt, and took a bunch of pictures of products that he thought people might be interested in. He pasted those into just a handful of catalogs, went out to the villages and recruited a few agents, and sat back to see what would happen. He had a bunch of questions. Would people order from a catalog? What kind of products would they order? And would agents sell from the catalog? So what he learned was, yes, people would order from the catalog. And when people placed an order, the shopkeeper would call him. He would personally run to the store, pick up the item, bring it, hand carry it to the village, and deliver it. Not something that is very scalable, certainly, but something that he was able to get up and running within a week. Then they also learned as people started ordering things, what are the kinds of products that people wanted. This helped them really tune their business and their strategy for what they were going to focus on. But there was also, on the third question, they were surprised. They originally thought that the people who would be their agents would be the folks who ran these kiosks, this sort of shops that sold consumer staples. What they found was that people running the kiosks weren't interested in selling from the catalog. They were more interested in moving the goods that they were carrying in inventory that they already paid for. So that's what they were really focused on their efforts on. The people who turned out to be much better agents were people who were running complementary businesses, like a hair salon, where they had customers coming in, they'd be waiting to get their hair cut, they could flip through the catalog, and it became an additional stream of revenue for them. And so all these things they were able to learn in the course of weeks and make dramatically better decisions about how they rolled out their business. Okay, so now we figured out, okay, we have something people want. The next question is, does it work? Does it actually deliver the impact that we're seeking? There's a nonprofit in South Africa called Harambee Youth Accelerator that I got to spend a couple weeks with last year. And they are tackling the scourge of youth unemployment that I know you are very aware of. They're focused particularly in South Africa, where it's become an epidemic, where there's, I think, 40% of youth is estimated are not in employment or education or training. And so what Harambee set out to do is look at, could they help train these youth to help disadvantaged youth get their first formal sector job? Now, a lot of organizations, when they're looking at something like youth employment, they start running trainings and counting how many people they get through trainings. But Harambee knew that impact for them meant not just getting people through a training, not just youth getting their first job, but that youth would need to stay in those jobs over time and get on a better track, and employers would need to see better performance and retention so that they would keep hiring these folks. So they really focused on this metric of long-term, 6-month retention as what they were driving for when it came to impact. And it led them to focus on data throughout the process, from the early assessments of how they determined which jobs to track youth to how they were performing during the training, to how they were doing on the job. And they learned a number of things. One thing they found was that they had been placing a lot of youth in retail stores. And they were seeing a fairly high degree of attrition. And so they went into the data to ask, why are we losing a lot of youth once they get placed in retail stores? And it turned out many of the youth just weren't accustomed to standing all day. And they weren't used to it, they weren't comfortable with it, and they just would quit. And so once they learned this, they decided, okay, we're going to start running our trainings and have all the youth stand during the training, so they'll get used to this before they get to the job and understand that this is going to be a requirement for them. And if they can't handle it, then they can look at other options. So with this, they were able to increase their retention rate in these retail jobs, but they were still seeing retention issues across the board. And so as they dug into their data more, they realized that one of the biggest factors in retention was proximity, that if you had to take more than 2 buses to get to your job, that these were pretty low-paying jobs, and it was just too expensive to get there. So the youth who were having to travel to their jobs were often dropping out more quickly. And so they made proximity one of the biggest factors in placing youth in jobs. And with that, they, again, were able to see much better retention. But then that exposed a different problem. They realized that in a particular community of Orange Farm, an apartheid area township, that they couldn't find jobs that were proximate enough because it was too far from any real economic activity. But they thought it was very important to serve these youth in a very, very poor township as well. And so they thought out of the box a little bit. They ended up placing them on cruise ships. Because you don't have to travel for your job. You get on the cruise ship and you can do your job there and come back on your breaks to visit your family. And so it was a creative solution that gave the kids a chance for some adventure as well. So we're all familiar with the theory of change. Again, in all our planning, we typically spend a lot of time creating a detailed theory of change. Too often, though, I see these theories of change end up on the bookshelf somewhere after we've written them. So instead, if we care about impact, we need to test our theory of change. We need to test each of the linkages from the early steps onward to figure out, is it playing out the way we expected? And can we optimize each of those linkages because it'll lead to greater impact down the road? And just as a simple example, one of the challenges with innovation for social good is that it can take a long time to realize impact in the world, right? So in this example, if you're distributing mosquito nets to lower the incidence of malaria in a community, it could take you years to see if that's really working. But if you look back, tomorrow you could test to see, are people hanging up those bed nets? If they're not hanging up the bed nets, if they're not sleeping under those bed nets, it's very unlikely that the incidence of malaria is going to go down, at least due to your own intervention. And so those are some of the early precursors you can test, and not only test to see are they hanging up the bed nets, but if, say, 60% of people are hanging up bed nets, can you optimize that? Can you get it up to 90% or 95% by having a training class in the community, giving out instruction manuals, maybe actually hanging the bed nets for them. Like, what are the things that might work? And those are the kinds of experiments that can help you optimize on each of those linkages to ensure that you have the best chance for the biggest impact down the road without waiting for years. So the final pillar of social innovation is growth. Again, if it has an impact, how do we get it to the people that need it? Like Vision Spring did. And one of the things I think we need to keep in perspective is that when it comes to foreign aid and philanthropy, we are a tinier and tinier piece of the puzzle. Foreign aid, my estimates now are that it's only about 2% of the funding that's going into developing countries to address things like the SDGs. Funding from private sources is about 10 times as much as that, and funding from local governments is probably 3 times greater than that even. And so we need to think about the role of foreign aid and philanthropy in a different way. In the past, we thought of it as like we're going to take the money and we're going to deliver stuff. I would say the new way we need to think about foreign aid and philanthropy is that we're going to take the money and we're going to experiment, find better solutions, and catalyze those much larger pools of funding, because we don't have enough money that we're ever going to get to everyone. And so there's a number of different models of how this might work. There's a number of, certainly the easiest path to scale is through a private sector business model. You sell something, you get money for it, you can invest in doing more, and you can scale that way. Where that's possible, it's certainly the easiest path to go. There's a number of companies for example, in the pay-as-you-go home solar system space that have really experimented with and are growing this business model of having people pay off home solar systems to light their homes by using mobile money so that they just pay a few cents a day and are able to keep the lights on and use something that's much cleaner and less polluting than kerosene. And so companies like Off-Grid Electric and Mcopa and others have been able to use this business model to serve hundreds of thousands of customers now and are rapidly growing as a result. And this is, Off-Grid Electric in particular was something we started funding at USAID at the lab. We gave them their first $100,000 grant to experiment with this new business model that no one had tried before, that the private sector wasn't willing to take a risk on yet. As they started getting traction, we gave them $1 million to start building out the business. And then as they started to scale, we gave them a $5 million grant that acted kind of like a first loss debt to help them draw in lenders that would provide the working capital that they needed to get all the solar systems, to purchase all the solar systems before people paid them off. And so by using our funding at USAID catalytically, our $6 million or so has catalyzed over $150 million in private debt and equity that is now, and a business model that is now financially sustainable and profitable that is going to continue to propel its way forward. And so I think that's a model that we need to think more about if we really care about scale. Of course, in our world, scale doesn't always come from private sector. Another way scale happens is through replication. Microfinance is, I think, the classic example here, where through, the Grameen Bank and BRAC started out with microfinance in Bangladesh. They didn't scale this around the world. Hundreds of both for-profit and non-profit organizations replicated this model and propagated it around the world. Another, when it comes to basic social services, government is usually the best option and the one that is the player that is most capable of delivering at scale when it comes to things like basic health and education. And so there's an organization called Evidence Action that is a nonprofit that is not coming up with their own solutions, but looking at solutions that already have strong evidence of efficacy. In this case, deworming pills, that the Copenhagen Consensus has estimated a 50-cent pill will pay off 60 times its value in dividends in the child's life. So it's a very high leverage intervention, but not something that was being deployed. And so Evidence Action has been working with governments to integrate it into school systems. And through their efforts, they're now reaching 190 million kids, not them directly, but by working with governments to incorporate it into their schools and leveraging the existing infrastructure and teachers and so forth. Another example is that I think is really fascinating, although a little controversial, is in Liberia. The government of Liberia a few years ago recognized that their school systems were simply failing. Kids were not getting a good education. In fact, one year, 0 of the kids who graduated from high school were able to pass the entrance exam for university. And so they recognized, we need to do better. And they were humble enough to say, we need help. And so they brought in 8 different providers, both for-profits and nonprofits, to take over some schools and to essentially operate the government schools and challenge them to see if they could deliver better educational outcomes for the same price of $50 a student a day. They ran a rigorous randomized control trial alongside of this, and after the first year, they found that almost all the providers did dramatically better. Some did twice as well. The kids were learning twice as much in 1 year as in the government schools. And so if this holds, the second year they've expanded and given out more school, but if it holds, it has the possibility of, finding models that that the government can adopt and can deliver much better results for the students in Liberia. So finally, I want to turn to the last principle of lean impact, which is to seek impact, and I would say relentlessly seek impact. We say that we are in this industry to deliver impact. That's what our missions are about. But too often, we get diverted from the path to greatest impact in the world. And there's a number of reasons that happens. One is that I think we tend to fall in love with our solutions rather than falling in love with the problems. Whether that solution is, there's a hot technology that I want to use, or that there's something that I came up with and have pride of ownership of, or that there's a particular role I want my organization to play. Too often, I talk to a lot of nonprofits. Everyone tells me they have the best solution, and I can't believe they're all right. And so if we fall in love with the problem instead, what we want to do is really look at, are we providing the most cost-effective solution? And if not, can we partner with others? Can we adopt the solutions of others? How do we actually get to the greatest impact in the world? And part of what it means to do that is to measure what matters, is to look at the data. There's a tendency to focus on what Eric calls vanity metrics, which are the absolute numbers of how many people did we reach, how much money did we raise, and so forth. How many people did we touch or reach and otherwise. These numbers are meaningless. The fact that you reach 1 million people doesn't tell you anything. It just tells you did stuff and you raised money. It doesn't tell you, did it make a difference for those people? Did you make those people's lives better? And even if you did make those people's lives better, could someone else have taken those same resources and reached more people or made a bigger difference? Those are the things that matter. And so instead of focusing on these absolute numbers, these vanity metrics, I think what we need to shift our focus to is the innovation metrics, which are usually the unit measures for every person or every 100 people you reach. What is the conversion rate? What is the adoption rate? What is the success rate? What is the unit cost? When you optimize for those things, if you can improve your success rate, if you can improve your adoption rate, you improve decrease your unit costs, those things will pay dividends over time. And so these are the metrics that we should be having front and center every day and optimizing for, knowing how we're doing and looking at how we can do better year over year. So I'll just end by saying, in the private sector, we're required, companies are required, to maximize shareholder value, maximize profits. And they do everything they can to maximize shareholder value and maximize profits. I think that we set the bar too low when it comes to social good. If someone is donating money, we pat them on the back because they're doing some good. If someone's volunteering their time, we pat them on the back because they're volunteering their time. If a company is donating money, we laud them for trying to do good. But we're setting the bar too low. I think we need to raise the bar. We need to demand not just that we're doing some impact, but if we're serious about our mission, we need to maximize both our impact and scale. And what that means is that we need to be more audacious about our goals. We need to experiment and test to figure out what's the best solution that we can deliver to meet that. And we need to stay relentlessly focused on getting to the biggest impact possible. Thank you. So I don't actually know what time it is, but hopefully we have time for some questions.
Yes, we have about 20 minutes.
Great. I think there's a mic here. If anyone has questions, happy to talk more about whatever you guys are interested in. Yes. I think that they're recording it, so they prefer if you use the mic.
Thank you very much. I'm Paul from ChildFund New Zealand. Your opening statement was we have to accelerate the pace of learning. And 2 weeks ago I spent a hard week with my kids preparing them for school exams, and they're 12 and 13, 2 boys. And their exams were based on the rote learning, regurgitation of knowledge. How well do you think school curricula is doing in creating curiosity amongst kids?
That's a great question. I'm not an education expert, so I'm not the best one to answer that. But let me give you an example of education is one of those spaces where we say it's hard to innovate because it takes a long time for us to measure educational attainment. There's an example I didn't include today because it's not in the global development space, but more domestic. And there's a nonprofit called Summit Public Schools that has been trying to tackle this question of how do we create, how do we improve learning dramatically? They set out with this goal of having 100% of their students that came from very diverse backgrounds graduate from college. And after the first, they sort of brought in all the state-of-the-art pedagogical techniques, kind of ran their school. 8 years later, when their first students graduated from college, they found that they were doing dramatically better than their peers. And so everyone's like, this is great, you should scale. But the founder, Diane, said, we're doing well, but we're not doing well enough. Like, we want to get to 100%. And I'm not going to wait another 8 years to figure out, like, whether, we're doing better by changing things. And so what she decided to do was actually build, instead of focusing on figuring out how to come up with the best thing and waiting another 8 years, they decided to focus on building a culture of learning into the organization and building a culture of learning and agility and innovation. And so what that meant is that they started gathering data. They set themselves up to run these week-long iterations where they would vary the content of the classroom, whether both the curriculum, whether it's teacher-led lectures, self-paced learning on computers, school projects, one-on-one tutoring, and they would take all these different things and try all the different methodologies, and they would gather data every week by doing student assessments, kind of getting feedback from teachers, doing focus groups, and look at what was working. And then each week they would tweak what they were doing based on that. And so over the course of a year, they actually ran 57 week-long experiments and learned very, very quickly kind of what was working and what wasn't. And that helped them refine this model of personalized learning that actually has, in their case, really flipped the classroom. They don't do a lot of teacher lectures anymore. It's a lot of self-paced learning, I think is like a third of the time, and then a lot of experiential kind of small group projects and things like that. And they're at the top of their class, and I think now there's over 300 schools across the country that have actually adopted their model in public schools. And so it's a great example of how you can iterate and learn even in a context that typically you don't see that happening. In terms of the best techniques for doing it, I'm not the expert, but I'm sure somebody else here is. Yes, please.
So working as a kind of advisor on a project for ChildFund, so I'm not technically, or I'm not a full-time member of ChildFund, but I am a business school professor who sort of really enjoy reading your book. I guess one problem I have with I agree with just about everything you said, Ann Mei, but I think that the challenge, I think that whether it's ChildFund or any other organization, Save the Children, whatever, is that the metaphor that you're using is almost like this kind of Silicon Valley startup. It's almost like you're trying to persuade like employees, managers at GE rather than let's say a startup. So it seems like there's a kind of disconnect a little bit between kind of that the metaphors that you're using in terms of, because I agree with everything you say, but it's almost like there's like learning models that works for like preschool that doesn't work for higher education, for instance, right? So if you try to apply it across all different kind of learning spectrum, then it doesn't kind of fit. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, in terms of stages of organizations, do you think that looking at your own sort of the book and applications of doing it, that perhaps that it may work fine for startup organizations like social enterprises, but perhaps for organizations like ChildFund for 80 years old, that some of them might be perhaps even cause problems if you try to implement it. So I was curious of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think with innovation in general, whether you're in the nonprofit sector or in the business world, it's always easier when you're in a small organization, right? Small organizations are always more nimble, newer organizations are always more nimble. But I think the core techniques are the same. But larger organizations, especially large established organizations that have an ingrained culture that's very different, have an additional challenge, which is how do we overcome the inertia of what we're used to doing, all the grooves we've kind of, how do you create grooves? All the grooves that you sort of created that you're used to over 80 years or however many years. And that's not an easy thing to do. So there's a few things I talk about in the book. I know you guys have the advantage here at ChildFund that you're not as dependent on grants. One of the questions I always get first is like, yes, this sounds great, but like I can't do this because my funders won't let me. And I'm happy to talk about that if people are interested, because there's ways to at least start moving in that direction. But there's a whole chapter in the book about culture, and I don't have enough time to go through the whole thing here, but what I would say is that we often try to change cultures of large organizations the wrong way. I know every NGO I know these days seems to have some sort of innovation team or innovation unit that's kind of tacked on the side. And so there's a set of folks here that are innovating and everybody else is sort of doing business as usual. And so what I think we need to do instead is, and the reason I wrote the book is to figure out how do we move that into the core. And part of that is that we can't go get up on stage and tell everyone to innovate and then they go back and then what we really ask them is like, did you, how many grants did you win, and like, did you execute on the grant as you said you would, and that's the incentive system. We have to change the incentives. And so the way to change the incentives, I think, starts with having an audacious goal. Like if you have a goal that is both at the organization level down to the individual level, where you cannot achieve your goal with business as usual. If you're serving 100,000 people now, you say, we want to serve 10 million people. You can't get there with business as usual. Then you have a reason to innovate. If you're serving 100,000 people, you say next year we're going to serve 120,000 people, you can sort of do the same thing and try to do it a little better, right? But if you say next year, or in 5 years, we want to get to 10 million people, you have to think outside of the box. It gives you a reason to take risks. It forces you to try different things. And I think that's where innovation starts. You have to change the underlying goals and incentives for everyone in the organization so that there's a reason to try something different and that you're rewarded for trying something different. There's a lot more to go with that, but that's where I would start. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Roland, ChildFund International in Asia. I have a somehow similar question. Going through your examples, I saw mostly you are bringing us examples of problems where it is relatively easy to agree what good looks like. However, we are working in fields where this question is quite contentious sometimes. Child protection, child marriages, violence against children, where it's not so clear that people can agree what is the right solution. Entrenched cultural practices and norms.
Yeah.
So I wonder, in that context, how would your model work
Yeah.
if we look at it in the same way?
That's a good question. I'm assuming, though, that you know what you think is good, right? That you have a point of view in these cases? Like, for example, child marriage, I'm assuming ChildFund has some point of view on what is good. This book is not trying to determine what is good. I'm assuming that people have generally determined that for themselves, and the intent of the book is to look at, once you determine what is good, how do you figure out how to get there? The challenge of determining what is good is a very big one and not one that I'm trying to tackle myself. But I think a lot of the things that we look at, are hard to measure. And also, if you're talking about how do we, for something like child marriage, you may have, it's not just a matter of executing on a particular intervention. You need to get buy-in, right? And so part of what what the approach says is that, if we go back to the kind of value pillar, if what we're trying to do is, prevent child marriage or raise the age of marriage, how do we do so in a way that the community sees value in it? And we might experiment with lots of different approaches to see whether it moves the needle on whether the community is bought into it. And I would argue that before you start scaling a program, we want to try a lot of different things, figure out is this sufficient buy-in, and only after we feel like we've gotten the level of buy-in we need do we then start scaling and deploying the program. But as to what the moral right answer is, I am not going to make that call. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Javier from Ecuador. I liked a lot when you said that we should be falling in love with the problem. What would it be the main or the key aspects that you should suggest to keep in mind in that case? On my side, I was thinking about how are we going to get an active involvement of the target population or the target group we're going to impact. But what are the characteristics you suggest that we should take into consideration?
Yeah, the characteristics I think that are important to focus on are very much the unit metrics for value growth and impact, right? So if we're trying to solve a problem, are we solving in a way that people are bought into? Is it actually working to deliver the results that we want? And do we have a model for scale that is an engine for growth that will accelerate growth over time so it gets to everybody in need? And so by focusing on those unit metrics, we stay focused on the problem and making sure we're both solving the problem for the individuals involved and having the impact and scale that is necessary to solve it for all the people who could benefit. Yes, please. Last one? Okay. They're going to fight. Two questions.
Sorry, Shelby. No, thank you for your presentation. There were two things that I thought I need to say something about. That the first one, which you said, we have to test our theories of change. And just a little sales pitch, certainly not in competition with your excellent book, but you will have found on your table this little leaflet. We're going to talk more about it later on our impact report, because that's exactly about testing our theories of change.
That's
starting
fantastic.
to look at our data. Are we producing the changes that we expected, et cetera, at a much higher level as maybe the type of examples you gave. The other part I called my attention was the minimal viable product. This morning, we had a session, and Mario here presented on a change process we did in the Americas, which is called Alternative Presence. Quite a number of changes in terms of organizational structure, standardization of programs, partnership portfolio, etc. And we tried to apply the smallified, minimal viable product approach. Now, looking back at it, I think where we failed was exactly coming up with those type of measurements which allows you that very rapid turnaround.
Right.
So we did a test in Bolivia of a program model, but we were still thinking about, so we need to understand if this program model, these interventions, these combinational interventions, is going to have an impact which you only will be able to measure around 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the line. So really I'd like to hear how to go about establishing those type of measurements which matter. That's what you said, measurements which matter, but which gives you that much more rapid feedback, even within months, or let's say maximum on a year basis.
Do you have an example of a kind of intervention that you're trying to do that with?
I think another part that we tried to change there was innovating our sponsorship processes. And then we went into discussions with our colleagues here around, but we need to understand how that is going to impact the retention of our sponsors. And then they said, well, but that we only will know 3 years down the line, because there's all these processes before you actually get to see that. So that's where I said we need. So what do we need to understand? What do we need to measure much earlier to be able to have that much more rapid innovation process that we're talking about?
Yeah, and there's no one answer for that. It's a very, very good question. It's one of the reasons it's so much harder to innovate in this space, is because a lot of the effects do take a long time. But you know, if we try something and we don't know if it works for 3 years, we're really shooting blind for quite a bit of time. And if we're wrong, it's going to take us a long time to try something else. So there's a real value to getting something earlier. And I think one thing that we need to accept, and I think gets in the way of doing this, is that those earlier indicators are not going to be as robust as the longer term. You know, it's not 100% for sure. It's a much lighter evidentiary status. And so, you know, in your example of like the 3-year retention of donors, you know, my question would be, so what causes retention for donors? Like, you know, what are the earlier things you could test and optimize for? Is it, you know, are they opening the emails? Like if people aren't opening the emails, or does that mean they're like less likely to be retained over time? It's certainly doesn't guarantee they will be if they are. Are they, you know, recommending their friends, you know, things like that. Like, what are the earlier things that are activities? And that's what I mean by testing the theory of change, is that there's some earlier things that you at least have a theory if people are more likely to tell their friends, or more likely to open the emails, or more likely to, I don't know, send an advocacy message or whatever it is, then they're more likely to stay over time. And so the testing theory of change is testing those early linkages and optimizing for those early linkages so you have the best chance possible that later on down the road you'll have the kind of results you want. No guarantee, but something you can find out much more quickly. And so it just depends on the particular type of result you're trying to get to. I'm happy to talk through other examples too. Yes, last question.
Yeah, mine kind of connects with the no guarantee and, having organizations feel comfortable to take risk and fail. And I'm just wondering if you've had examples of, we have organizations who are sponsored. We, like you mentioned, we don't have to rely on grants. We have to create other incentives for us to try and innovate. So I'm just wondering, for those organizations who might need a little what have you seen influences change to push an organization into more of an innovative mindset?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I still think it's what I said earlier, is setting goals that you can't reach with business as usual. Like we just don't, I don't think we set our sights high enough, most organizations that I know, that we tend to have incremental goals. And so just like the President Kennedy said, let's send a man to the moon. We had no idea how to do it. We figured it out. Like Vision Spring, they set their eyes on the 2.5 billion, and they figured out their way to try and get there. I think we need to set higher goals for ourselves, and that's really the starting point.
So join me in thanking Ann Mei.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Ann has encouraged me to think big, like bigger than I imagined before, but to figure out what I can do tomorrow morning, in the moment, in my job, while I'm doing everything else. So stay focused on the big prize, but what can we do very small? So I want to thank Ann Mei again, and I want to thank all of our presenters from today, this morning through the afternoon. And I'd like to invite you to join us down the escalator, and we have a reception where we can celebrate our 80 years of experience and wisdom in this work. Thank you.